You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 25. They were still 3 days and 3 nights out from Bamboo Island, and Karyne was beginning to wish he hadn't given up his cabin for Lenda and Aura. When the men weren't glaring at the women, they turned their suspicions on Karyne. He leaned against the main mast, watching the men laugh and eat their meal. Thallahan had pulled out his fiddle, and a few who'd had too much ale stomped their feet and danced without partners. The moon shone over the water, waning from the full moon. If Bamboo Island didn't hold answers, an inland trek would be treacherous with full-grown winnocks out on the prowl. The silvery beasts waxed and waned with the moon, their short lives balanced out by their infinite rebirth, if they survived each cycle. During a new moon, their newborn cries were annoying, but they held no danger. During a full moon, coming across a pack was deadly. They grew weaker as the new moon and their rebirth approached, but sometimes weaker meant more desperate. Karyne glanced at Riverin up in the crow's nest. Maybe that was why Enla insisted he bring Riverin. He'd always been able to manage the creatures the same way he'd managed horses. Before he could think it through, Karyne climbed the rigging, joining his former friend in the tight space. Riverin gave him a wary look before returning his gaze to the sea, his watchful eyes taking in any potential danger. Gullet blinked at Karyne, then let his eyes slide shut. The birds spent most of the day on the coast they skirted, hunting and foraging, then joined up with Riverin at night. Karyne shifted his gaze to the X on Riverin's forehead, the scars forming an outline for the bold ink. Rather than keep staring, he pulled out his dagger, weighing its balance over his knuckles and testing its point against the pad of his finger.
"You haven't replaced that daisy yet?"
Karyne's lip lifted at the surprise in Riverin's voice. "I told you, it doesn't make me look weak." Riverin shook his head.
"People are probably just saying it behind your back."
They'd argued over it when Karyne had had the dagger made. It was a gift for Daisy, her dedication year dagger. Riverin thought it was fine for a girl, but he'd teased Karyne mercilessly for carrying it around.
"The men think you've gone mad."
Riverin's soft rumble put Karyne at ease despite his words. "Because of the women?" Riverin nodded.
"At first I thought Aura was the girl you've been searching for, but you're still hunting for something or someone. It didn't feel right."
Karyne didn't say anything, unwilling to confirm or deny Riverin's line of thinking.
"The men won't talk to me either, but I still hear things. Thallahan defends you. Says it's good for a man to keep his women close, to keep them safe."
Karyne cringed. "They're not my women."
"Lenda is, in a way, just like you're her man. But they've all latched on to that, and now they're heralding you as the prince with 2 bonds.
Riverin's smirk stirred up Karyne's irritation. "Aura is twice my age."
"Is she?"
Riverin's brow furrowed, making the X shift into a jagged squiggle.
"She doesn't seem that old."
Karyne didn't honestly know or care, but he wouldn't stand for rumors about the women. Just because he didn't love Lenda the way he should, didn't mean he would cheat on her. "Lenda is my bondmate, and I will remain faithful." His words silenced Riverin, and the air between them grew thick with the unspoken reminder and accusation. Why had Karyne come up here? This would always sit between them. It wasn't like he could ever regain the friend he'd once had, no matter how much he might want to. The realization that he wanted their friendship back was like cold seawater splashing overboard. Even wanting it felt like he'd betrayed Enla in some way. He stood, throwing a leg over the nest's edge.
I didn't tell you those things to rile you,
Riverine said, eyes still trained on the horizon.
The point is that the men think you're besotted. Despite the bad luck you've brought on the ship, they understand. In fact, it makes you seem more like them and less like some inaccessible royal brat.
Garen paused, one foot on the rigging. I haven't completely lost their respect? Riverine snorted.
It's not about respect. Well, it is, but not in the way you're thinking.
He turned his gaze on Garen.
They're recreants, not loyalists.
The admission was treasonous, but Riverine wasn't saying anything Garen didn't already know. I'm not asking them to be loyal to the crown. Garen frowned at Gullet, who fluttered his wings and turned his tail feathers toward Garen. I want respect as their captain. I want them to trust me.
You should want their camaraderie more than their respect,
Riverine said.
They aren't willing to die for their superior, but they're willing to die for their friend.
Garen's chest tightened. He'd been willing to die for Riverine at one point. Nearly had when they'd gotten in over their heads with some fresh progenies who'd had a score to settle with Riverine. He'd loved him like a brother. That kind of love trumps respect, Garen said. But it also goes both ways. I would need to be willing to die for them. Riverine hummed his agreement, turning back to the water now that his point had been made. Garen glanced down at the men below him, their laughter carrying out across the water. The carefree teasing reminded him of his childhood, even though most of the men were old enough to be his father or grandfather. He knew them all by name, even knew many of their families, but he'd purposely kept them at arm's length. When he knew too much, he grew too frustrated with his inability to change their circumstances. Bringing bread to Eric was one thing, but Enla would never let Garen patch up the boy's drafty home or ensure his mother had adequate care from healers. Not unless Garen turned it into a program he could manage, and then he'd hear everyone's woes and feel even more helpless. Was it so strange to want to know these men as friends? To be willing to die for men who served on his ship? He could practically hear Enla's frustrated voice in his head. She believed he was worth hundreds of their people. But wasn't that part of what he hated about his family's tyranny? How could he say he valued democracy if he wasn't valuing the people fighting for it? Thank you, Garen said, unable to look Riverine in the eye. It didn't matter, because the other man nodded, gaze on the water. As Garen made his way back down, he tuned in to the men around him, sensing their warmth. He rarely used his skills without first asking permission. It felt like a violation of someone's privacy. But all these men knew his spoke, and they'd all signed on to work for him, knowing their proximity alone put their memories within his reach. His progeny mentors would scold him for needlessly using magic, especially at night without the sun's energy to recharge. But maybe this exception to all the rules was more necessary than ever. Eric stood on the outskirts, young enough to not know his place in the crowd. When Garen came close, the boy turned with a smile, then started upon seeing his captain. He ducked his head. It's good to see you having fun, Eric. The boy smiled, hesitantly. Was it hard leaving your family? Eric's smile faltered. Harder than I expected. Images from Eric's mind flashed through Garen's. His parents smiling down at his siblings, his mother's hand over her distended belly, squalling infants being handed to Eric one by one as he met his siblings for the first time, the pang of loss over missing this newest sibling's birth. Probably easier to leave the horse manure, though, Garen suggested. Eric laughed, and the edges of the sorrow blurred. I promised my sisters I'd bring them seashells.
Larkos says there are blue ones off the coast of Bamboo Island.
Ah, the butter clams, Karyne said. Those are nice, but I bet we can find some sundial shells that will really impress them. Or some of the tiny clams near Rykarn have pink and orange shells. The boy's eyes lit up, and Karyne ruffled his hair. Climb on up to watch the water for a bit with Riverin. Eric fought for footing on the rigging before Karyne could even finish his instructions. He chuckled and moved on to Breve, who was only a few years Eric's senior. He'd done his time as cabin boy and swab, and while he couldn't cook well, the job suited him. The chicken had good flavor tonight, Karyne lied. Have you been taking lessons? An image flashed through Breve's mind, and Karyne tuned into it. A woman in an apron, smiling from behind the stove.
Just helping Ma between jobs.
Breve's pimply face always had a red hue, but in the wake of Karyne's compliment, the color reached the tips of his ears. Your mother probably worries too much, yeah? The young man's grin filled his face.
Of course. That's what Ma always does. She's got 4 others at home. You'd think they'd be enough to keep her mind off me.
The other children's faces passed through Breve's mind and then Karyne's, their shapes taking form and movement. Shrieks of laughter, hay-filled hair, skinny legs wrapped around ropes, swinging in a barn. Karyne slapped Breve on the back, letting his hand rest on the young man's bony shoulder. He didn't need to maintain contact to tune into Breve's memories, but they grew far more vivid this way. He felt the emotion instead of just seeing it. It made his heart ache and his throat tighten. It made him long for home, even though he'd never had a home with such carefree abandon. His parents probably didn't even miss him. Were they doing well? Or had his mother's health taken a turn for the worse? He shook himself from his thoughts, focusing on Breve once more. You're the oldest, right? Karyne already knew the answer after seeing Breve's memories, but he waited for Breve's nod before continuing. What does your father do? Are you going to carry on his line of work? Breve faltered.
I am carrying on his work. He died at sea when I was 12, aboard one of your father's vessels.
The image that came to Karyne this time was fuzzier, faded with years and probably altered by the boy's grief and adoration. He didn't recognize the man, but then he would have been 17 or 18 when Breve's father had died. Still, he felt chastened. He should have known this about Breve. Well, it's an honor to have a second-generation sailor on my ship. Breve stood a little taller.
4th generation, sir.
Karyne raised an eyebrow. No wonder you climb the rigging like a spider. He slapped Breve on the back once more. He moved on to Thalahan, who had passed his fiddle off to an older sailor. He smiled as easily as Breve, but his burly physique and shaved head made Karyne think he'd be more like Larkos in a few years. He even had a few tattoos on his arms, working up to a fine sailor's collection. As they watched the other sailors dancing, Thalahan's memories of a woman were so vivid they left Karyne yearning to meet her. It didn't take much to get Thalahan talking about her, his mind recalling how they'd first met and where they liked to take walks. Karyne pulled back on his Starlock's power when the memories became too private. She's waded through 3 voyages for you? Karyne asked, stealing a glass of ale from on top of a barrel as they walked past. Why haven't you proposed already? Not many women are patient enough to deal with the comings and goings of a sailor. I plan to. It was hard to tell in the moonlight, but Karyne thought Thalahan's face might have turned a shade of pink. You promised us enough this time around that her father should say yes. Thalahan's words struck that same guilty nerve that Enla often hit. Karyne paid his men well, far more than average, but he hadn't realized it still wasn't enough to guarantee supporting a family. He took a sip to hide his uncertainty over whether an apology or congratulations was in order. Must be nice to not have to worry about the father or the daughter saying no, Thalahan said, elbowing Karyne with a cheeky grin. Karyne choked on his ale before glancing at the closed door to his quarters. Lenda had made more appearances over the last day, but he doubted she'd come out for tonight's revelry. A longing to sweep her in his arms for a dance flowed through him, and he frowned at the bond's insistence. Or not, Thalahan said, wincing. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked away. Karyne felt their easiness slipping away as Thalahan rebuilt the wall dividing their stations. He didn't want to lose the ground he'd made, especially not over his sour attitude toward his bondmate. Would it surprise you to know I envy your freedom? Karyne asked, tensing at his admission. Thalahan's gaze swung to Karyne, his mouth slack. He quickly closed his lips, licking them nervously. Yes? The word came out more like a question, a fear of saying the wrong thing. Does this mean, he lowered his voice conspiratorially, that you really do wish to be bonded with Aura? Karyne barked out a laugh. I guess that's a no. Thalahan's shoulders drooped. Correct. Aura is more of a business partner, like Larkos. Karyne took another sip. He could never break his bond, not after seeing it happen to Enla. But in some ways, wanting another woman made sense considering how much he resisted the bond. Instead, he was left wanting something he couldn't have with a woman who likely didn't exist. Thalahan grunted his understanding. He would probably dispel the rumors later that night, and then what would the men have to speculate about? What's it like to fall for a woman of your own will? Karyne's gaze returned to the closed door as he mused out loud. To know that she loves you not because magic deems it so, but because her mind, soul, and body choose to. Thalahan didn't say anything for a while, and Karyne didn't expect him to. They watched the men grow louder as they finished eating, more of them laughing and singing along with the fiddler. My pa once told me it was like earning his starlock. Thalahan's voice was so low, Karyne almost missed it. He described it as a rush that left you equally empowered, invigorated by desire, and vulnerable, deeply aware of your weaknesses. Except instead of growing used to it, growing into the feeling as you do when you learn to wield the source of magic. He eyed the bulge beneath Karyne's shirt. Love makes you feel the same old fool every time you lay eyes on her. Karyne let his eyes slide shut, the memory of his awakening flooding through him. It had been his 5th time at sea with Starspeed, and the worst storm he'd seen in his life. The boat had risen and fallen with every swell, filling faster than they'd been able to pump it out from the bilges. He hadn't felt brave climbing the main mast to untangle the sails. He had known it could snap at any moment, and it would be the end of him. He'd been scared senseless. But he'd done it anyway. He'd seen the sailors beneath him cheer, but the wind had taken away the sound of their voices, and then the next wave had taken him away from the ship. He still wasn't sure how he'd survived the thrashing waves to wash ashore, but he would never forget the euphoria of waking with the silver teardrop squeezed so tightly in his palm that it drew blood. The grin that split his face from relief at having survived not just the storm, but his awakening. The warmth of the metal spreading through to his toes. At least, that's what he said about my ma. Thalahan's voice pulled Karyne from the memory, forcing his eyes to open and refocus on the man beside him. And when I met Faye, I understood. I have to take his word for it when it comes to the Starlock. Thalahan's voice was laced with a wistfulness, having never experienced an awakening. Karyne's smile felt strained. It's a perfect description. And I'll have to take your word for it when it comes to falling in love. He couldn't keep the same wistfulness from tainting his words, having never experienced it for myself. The men shared a rueful smile. Speaking of bonds, Thalahan angled his head toward the stern, and Karyne turned to follow his gaze. The cabin door swung wide, revealing Lenda's silhouette as she stepped onto the deck. Karyne's heart picked up its pace as she moved into the lantern's light. Her eyes brightened, and her hesitant smile deepened when she caught him studying her, but it was more like a winix reeling in its prey. The rush he'd hoped to feel was gone as quickly as it had come, without ever having reached a fraction of the euphoria he'd felt after his awakening. "I stand by my initial assessment," Karyne muttered to Thalahan. "I envy your freedom." Chapter 26. Karyne made his way across the deck, gaze on Lenda. A quick glance at Aura revealed a matronly nod of approval, and he nearly laughed at the sailor's assumptions about him. 2 bonds. What would he do with 2 bondmates when he couldn't handle 1? Lenda held out a hand. He lifted it for a kiss, clenching his jaw at the way it made his heart pound. "You're looking refreshed?" Her face wilted slightly at his words, like she'd expected more of a compliment. He tried again. "There's a glow to your cheeks that was missing the last several days." This time she leaned into him, practically purring. "I think life at sea is finally starting to agree with me." "By the time we reach Bamboo Island, you'll be swinging from the rigging." She glanced up, swallowing hard as she took in the full height of the main mast. "How about I conquer the sea on this trip, and heights on the next?" Her dry humor surprised and even enticed him, but there was an assumption of future trips together that left him sober. She was his future, whether he wanted her to be or not. He wasn't sure why he fought the bond. Lenda was shallow, but she wasn't cruel or hungry for power, a rare thing in a destructive somatic progeny. He could do far worse in a bondmate. And yet, even before Thalahan shared his experiences, Karyne had always sensed there was something more to a bond. Something that his would always be missing. The music stopped, drawing his attention to the men around him, some gawking without shame, others trying to clear their dinner mess to make room for the women. Aura gently pried the fiddle from the slack-jawed sailor's hands before settling herself on a bench amongst the men, like she'd been there all her life. With a pointed look in Karyne and Lenda's direction, the strange woman started in on a complicated tune that immediately got boots tapping. "Would you like to dance?" Karyne held out a hand, nearly choking on the words. Enla would be pleased with Aura's interference. Lenda took his hand, and together they weaved throughout the deck, spurred on by the men's shouts whenever they drew near. A second sailor pulled Lenda's maid out on the deck, swinging her around with little finesse, but her laughter proved she didn't mind. Even the men started partnering up, tripping over each other's feet and laughing. Thalahan sat near Aura, his eyes narrowed in concentration as he watched her fiddle. Aura entertained them with 2 more songs, during which Lenda allowed herself to be passed from sailor to sailor before settling in Karyne's arms once more. "I think you made Eric's entire moon by dancing with him tonight." Karyne laughed, taking in the flush of Lenda's cheeks and the wisps of light hair coming loose from her braid. "He's sweet," she said, glancing back at the cabin boy still watching her with stars in his eyes. "A far finer dancer than all the men reeking of ale. It's a shame he'll end up just like them." She wrinkled her nose, and just like that, all the ways he'd started to find her endearing dissolved. His arms suddenly felt stiff, the space between them too narrow. This was why their bond never fully took. "I hope he ends up exactly like Larkos," Karyne said. "A fine father and sailor, a loyal bondmate with a loving wife, a man free to spend his summers at sea and his winters by her side." He didn't bother hiding the hunger lacing his words, and Lenda missed a step to turn sharply his way. Aura switched to a melancholy tune, and Karyne and Lenda slowed. Eager to avoid Lenda's reproachful stare, he watched Aura's bow slide across the strings. I wonder where she learned to play, Karyne mused. She told me she was raised on the seas. Gave me all sorts of tips on finding my sea legs because she's seen everything tried and knew what worked. I suppose she learned from a sailor. The explanation made sense, and yet it felt off. Like every tidbit he learned about Aura, it only brought out more questions. Did you know her great-great-great-grandmother married Captain Moss after the last war? For once, Lenda's interest seemed sincere. She told me all about how she saved his life. Captain Moss? Karyne narrowed his eyes as he studied Aura once more. She did resemble the portraits he'd seen of Lady Redwood. But in the version he'd heard, the ex-pirate had married the famous captain after he'd saved her life at sea, not the other way around. Everyone knows that story. It's not very likely the woman was really her great-great-grandmother. Great-great-great-grandmother, Lenda corrected. She stepped away and grabbed a glass of ale, sipping at it daintily before making a face at its bitterness. She added impeccable details, so she's either a professional storyteller or the real story has been passed down in her family. You've grown to like her. Karyne said the words like an accusation, noting Lenda's defensiveness as she watched Aura pass the fiddle back to Thalahan. Lenda shrugged. I wonder if it's possible for anyone to not like her. There's something about her. She turned a haughty gaze on Karyne, slipping back into her familiar facade. Except for maybe you. You find a way to dislike everyone and everything. Karyne laughed, drawing the attention of the men around him. Even Aura glanced his way with her secretive smile, like she'd planned this whole evening for the sake of his bond. She was as bad as Enla. But she wasn't the only one who could manipulate situations. She'd been tight-lipped earlier, but if she was so forthcoming with Lenda, maybe he could use that to his advantage. Lenda tells me you have famous kindred. He let the words ring out, guaranteeing the sailors would pay attention. I'm sure everyone here would be eager for tales of Lady Redwood. A few of the men gasped, while others gave Aura incredulous looks. To her credit, she showed no concern about being found out. In fact, she closed her eyes and tilted her head as if calling up a memory. Karyne leaned forward, recognizing her actions from his own efforts to tune in to memories. Her eyes flew open, a new spark of life shining out from deep within her. I know there's wild debate among sailors as to whether Captain Moss saved Lady Redwood or whether Lady Redwood saved Captain Moss, but I guarantee you the pirate saved the naval officer. That version says she made a fool of him, too. He never would have married her if he'd been made a fool by her, a sailor shouted. No? Aura's eyebrows rose in disbelief. How many of you have been made a fool by the woman you love? The men all eyed each other, as if daring someone to admit such a thing. It may not have been as public, but I guarantee it happened. Love makes a fool out of every man eventually, she shrugged. And every woman. My pa hammered his thumb while staring at my ma one day, Eric admitted. The other men chuckled, and Aura smiled. Thank you for that perfect example. Lady Redwood made a fool of Captain Moss several times, and then she saved his life. It's possible he returned the favor, but by then he was smitten anyway. She stared at the moon, pausing long enough to make everyone shift uneasily. Her smile slowly faded to something forlorn and haunted, like someone lost in a memory. Karyne felt certain at that moment that she had loved someone deeply. Loved someone and lost them. She cleared her throat. Forgive me. Where was I? Her grin turned almost wicked as she leaned forward. Oh, yes. It all started when the fearsome pirate Redwood plundered Captain Moss's ship. As Aura continued spellbinding the men, Karyne bent toward Lenda. Did you notice the way she called up the memory? Lenda responded, her attention on Aura even though she'd already heard the story. She must be a noetic. I would bet my life on it. Lenda finally turned to look at him, letting out an unladylike snort that surprised him. Well, then one of us should be dead, because I'd be willing to bet my life that she's a somatic. She healed me, Karyne. I've never been able to function this soon on a ship. I've never been able to function at all, and I get the impression I'll never have such awful seasickness again. Karyne frowned. If that was true, Aura definitely had to have a second spoke like Karyne and Enla. It was rare outside the royal family. It usually only manifested in those with higher star blood concentration, those who would have shown up as potential bondmates to keep the royal family's bloodline as pure as possible. Could a second spoke give her the power to leave her body the way she did? She was too old for Karyne, and he suspected she was too young to have been matched with his father. Still, Karyne had 3 uncles also in line for the throne who had been bonded at young ages. As far as he knew, none of his aunts had secondary spokes. Shouldn't Aura's blood have been chosen before those women's? Is it possible to avoid being in the running for a royal bond? He asked the question of Lenda, but only because she was close enough to hear. Really, he wanted to ask Enla or his parents, people who cared far more about those details than he ever had. He assumed it was an honor and privilege that everyone would register their children's blood in the hopes that their child would become the next king or queen. But what if not everyone wanted that responsibility? After all, he hadn't wanted it. He glanced around at the men aboard the ship. None of them even wanted a king or queen, so why would they force their child to be considered for a role they hoped to usurp? What are you talking about? Lenda asked. Never mind, he muttered. He listened to Aura's story half-heartedly, his thoughts swirling too much to focus. The idea that Aura might have avoided bonding or that some people might despise the throne enough to keep their children from the pool of bondmate applicants was like a punch to his gut. It didn't matter that he'd supported the people's desire for more rights or that they'd wanted more of a say in their laws and where their money went. This felt more personal, like they rejected the LNS family as people, not just their titles and crowns. He could almost understand it when it came to his parents. For the most part, they were fair rulers, but Karyne knew they weren't perfect. They'd upheld laws that should have been done away with years ago, taxes for money they didn't need, unnecessary authority over business structures that didn't impact their roles. The list was endless, according to Larkos, who'd been ranting about it again just that afternoon. But Karyne and Enla were still growing into their roles. They were moldable, and the people should see that as an opportunity. The fact that they didn't made Karyne spiral right back into the teaching he grew up with, the idea that the people wouldn't know how to rule themselves, which was why they needed kings and queens in the first place. He rubbed his temples, hating where his thoughts were going, but not knowing how to stop them. What would it take to prove to the people that he wasn't the same as the men and women before him? What could he do to let them give Enla the opportunity to make change instead of digging her own grave as the people grew more discontented? Do you know what Lady Redwood gave her beloved captain as a wedding gift? Aura's question and theatrical pause drew Karyne's attention. The story was coming to a close, and he'd hardly heard any of it. The men all shook their heads, each on the edge of whatever barrel, bench, or space they could call a seat. The ancient cutlass she'd stolen from him on that first raid when they'd met. A few men clapped, while the others laughed. Lenda had been right about Aura knowing details that weren't included in the story sailors typically shared, but Karyne wasn't sure if that made it truer or just a better lie. Ancient cutlass? Karyne asked. How old was this sword, and where is it now? Aura's secretive smile returned, the glow in her eyes receding as she went from a lively narrator to her former mask of subdued wisdom. Some say it was made by the Devlonians themselves. Breves sucked in a breath, excited at the prospect. Before the Great Divide and the rise of the barriers, the Devlonians had separated themselves from the Vendarans by claiming lands far east. They valued intelligence over physical strength, whereas the Amranans, who had settled in the north, were strong but simple-minded. Each race was the product of half-lights attempting to breed what they believed was the best of the best. Collectors around Vendaris claimed to have some of the rare Devlonian artifacts that had survived the Great Divide, but somehow the number of artifacts grew each year, making Karyne suspect each one's authenticity. Even their advanced metals would have corroded in that time, Karyne argued. Aura wrapped her arms around her knees, tucking them up under her chin like a child. She toyed with the braid on her wrist.
True, which is why I suspect it has different origins.
Her words felt heavy with meaning as they drifted over the heads of his men. Was she giving him a clue?
I suppose we'll never know.
She turned to Thalahan, requesting a song. Everyone else resumed their shouting and dancing, prepared for a long night that would turn into an even longer tomorrow at sea. Karyne still stared at Aura, ignoring Lenda's tug on his shirt sleeve. Aura had said she wrote the notes in the front of the book, The Sins of the Stars. He pulled it out from his coat pocket now, his gaze landing on the miniature weapon with the word Falls. An ancient sword unaffected by corrosion. One with different origins, perhaps celestial origins. Lady Redwood's cutlass was one of the Starbridges. This time, when he glanced back at Aura, she gave him a knowing look and a nod.
I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might enjoy listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where Paeter and I narrate fantasy short stories from a variety of authors to help you find your next favorite author. Check it out at findingfantasyreads.com. Thanks so much for listening.